Hello and welcome back to Perspectives. On today's show, outrage as US government ICE agents raid a New Jersey Gurdwara at 2 a.m. Meanwhile, also in the United States, the RSS are forced to withdraw after being uncovered hiring a lobbying firm to pressure the US administration to push its extremist Hindutva agenda. And we look at India's failing judicial system as a Sikh professor, originally sentenced to 20 years in prison under questionable charges in the first place, remains in prison after 31 years. And similarly, flying in the face of so-called democratic rule of law, Jagtar Singh Johal spends his 9th birthday in arbitrary detention in India's authoritarian state with still no justice in sight. And India, laughably, still calls itself a democracy. We'll listen more on today's show. And of course, we'll take a look at loads of great comments at the end of the show, so do stay tuned for that. Okay, loads to get through this morning. And I'm going to start with this ICE raid in New Jersey. It turns out, astonishingly, ICE have come under an awful lot of fire, and I try to remain fairly impartial on this because, of course, they are basically doing the work as instructed by the US government, as elected by the majority of people in the United States. But the way they've been going about it has, of course, caused an awful lot of controversy. And one of the key areas that has rather upset a lot of people, particularly in our audience, if you're in the United States, is Gurdwaras and places of worship are supposed to be sanctuaries. They actually are supposed to be held in at least some level of reverence, legally speaking, or spiritually speaking, but from a legal perspective, by law enforcement. In other words, you must only, as a law enforcement agent, enter a place of worship when you're raiding it after a series of processes, a systemic process, to ensure that what you are doing is absolutely justified. In other words, this isn't somebody's house, this isn't a business premise, this is a place of worship which must be treated with a higher degree of respect. Now, up until very recently, that was the case. And Gurdwaras and other places of worship would only ever be raided in such a manner when a whole due process was followed, when there was suspicions that in this case there could have been illegal immigrants or people undertaking illegal activity, that then those investigating it and those about to launch the raid would then have to go up the chain of command, seek consent from senior management to then get that signed off. Yes, you may raid that Gurdwara, and senior management obviously look at the evidence and on the balance of probabilities either say yes or no, but at least it would have the oversight of much senior officers whether or not to justify the raid. Unfortunately, in recent times, President Trump's administration has changed the rules slightly, and they've lowered that bar, lowered that threshold of oversight, of managerial oversight. So it is actually easier, much easier now for lower level agents in ICE to launch raids on places of worship. And unfortunately, it does seem that such a raid has taken place on this Gurdwara, the Bridgewater Gurdwara in New Jersey. And interestingly, it happened at 2 a.m. Now, you have to understand, of course, law enforcement do tend to do some of its operations in the middle of the night to catch people either at home or unawares or not prepared to resist. So there is method in their madness. But this is a place of worship. This is a Gurdwara. And raiding it at 2 a.m., one has to sort of question, really, was this the right way? Was it justified? Because as it turned out anyway, there were no arrests. But this news will understandably concern American Sikhs right across the nation, given, of course, the methodology of ICE agents. And it sends really the wrong signals from the US administration to actually a community it really needs to keep on side, because the community as a whole is obviously very law-abiding. The community as a whole wants to follow the laws of the United States. It does not want to make an example of itself on the wrong side of the law. It wants to assist law enforcement. But unfortunately, when you get situations like this, where the US administration agents are essentially pushing the boundaries a little here, all they're doing is upsetting a community that it really does not need to upset. And this unfortunately follows on the coattails of many other incidents where Sikhs who have been rounded up, who are in fact illegal immigrants, and again, perfectly justified to be arrested if you are an illegal immigrant. But ultimately, even if you're an illegal immigrant, your human rights still need to be respected, because ultimately this is a democratic nation that follows the rule of law. When those people are rounded up, their religious symbols, articles of faith, etc., must be respected. In other words, you mustn't remove their dastar and similar situations, which of course has been reported, where the articles of faith have been severely disrespected. That is unnecessary. That is pushing the line. That is crossing a line. And unfortunately, there's an increasing amount of incidents like this. As I say, ICE has a job to do. It is enacting the job it was instructed to do by the US elected government. And it's interesting also, just to sort of add a little side note on this one, as we all get very aerated and angry about this. Ultimately, the actions of ICE, the root of ICE's operations is basically a huge operation to remove illegal immigrants from the United States. Now, interestingly, and thank you to one of my correspondents who sent me a video of this. You know who you are. Thank you for this. Just a couple of weeks ago, there was a load of polls were taken by most of the major news stations in the United States. The polls were basically very simple. They said, do you support the removal of illegal immigrants from the United States? Now, according to the very left-wing biased press, it would lead you to believe that it's a minority. Most Americans really are against this whole operation. Actually, every single news outlet in their poll came back with a majority, and not just a small majority, a very large majority, ranging from, if I recall correctly, between 59% up to 69, 70% of respondents to that poll, even left-wing outlets. All the respondents, by a very large majority, were in support of removing illegal immigrants. That's why basically the Trump administration was elected, by a majority, because the majority of Americans do agree with the removal of illegal immigrants. The clue is in the name, illegal immigrants. And of course, the vast majority of American citizens are legal citizens and also want the law to be enacted. The law is there to protect the society, to protect civilization, to protect our everyday lives. So of course, everybody, not everybody, that is an overestimate, but the majority of people in the United States do support the removal of illegal immigrants. However, this is a big however in capital letters, the agents who undertake those operations must respect also the human rights of those that they are removing. Even if they are illegal, they still have basic human rights that must be respected. That is where it's going wrong. That is the key distinction that we must highlight. And certainly the point of accusation must be levelled at ICE. You must still respect human rights when you are enacting the law. Simple as that. Okay, let's move on. This is a deeply shocking story. This is the story of a professor who was imprisoned 31 years ago. His name is Professor Devinderpal Singh Bhullar. He's actually, and I don't know if many of our audience are aware of Professor Bhullar's existence, but I hope you are, and I hope after this next segment you will be more aware of his existence. He's a political prisoner, yes, another one. And he's just had his latest application for release rejected by Indian authorities. Go figure. I want to tell you the story of Professor Devinderpal Singh Bhullar, because it's, again, if ever we need more justification for the establishment of Khalistan, it is stories like this. It's a very symbolic story. He was a popular Panthic figure in the early 1990s. He was actually a chemical engineer. He was a professor, so a highly intelligent, highly qualified individual. And he was a professor at the Guru Nanak Engineering College in Punjab, in Ludhiana. Now, at the time when the Sikh genocide was at its peak during those terrible years of the late 80s and early 90s, and of course, during that time, thousands, tens of thousands, if not even potentially hundreds of thousands of young Sikh men were missing, basically murdered by the Indian state. And tens of thousands of these men, along with countless women and children too, were actually murder victims of the Indian police, carrying out these fake encounter massacres right across Punjab, where police officers, people that you should be able to trust, but clearly these police officers would either claim to have released someone who then disappeared, or just basically fabricate a story where they were forced to kill those that they disappeared. And of course, historians, including many who've since themselves lost their lives by highlighting this fact, Jagtar Singh Johal is one name that immediately springs to mind. Historians estimate anything between 50,000 and 200,000 or more Sikhs were killed between 1984, of course that year of Operation Blue Star and the Sikh genocide, and 1995. As noted by all sorts of human rights organisations, including NSAF, the killings actually have continued even up to at least 2012. And we do know there's still potentially going on now. And of course, officers guilty of these massacres are still being prosecuted to this day and are still avoiding justice. When I say they're being prosecuted, even just one case just last week, when they're prosecuted, they're usually acquitted. And it is felt that only a handful of those who are guilty of these crimes are still being held accountable. And only after they've already had decades of freedom, living their lives to the full before they're finally dragged before justice. Now, when several of Professor Buller's students started going missing in that period, he began to speak out, of course he would. He spoke out saying, our students are disappearing. He also started to speak about, obviously he realised what was going on, he started to speak about the atrocities and started being much more active and advocating for justice. And this, unsurprisingly, many like him, led him to becoming a target for the Indian state. And by speaking out, attention then directly turned towards his existence from the Indian state and, of course, the local Punjab police. So in 1990, Professor Buller was teaching engineering courses at that Guru Nanak Polytechnic College in Ludhiana. He was then implicated for his alleged role in the bombing of Senior Superintendent of Police, SSP, Sumed Saini. And there was a bombing of his vehicle. Now, when the police then failed to locate Professor Buller, they arrested his father and one other member of his family. They tortured them, and then they both died in custody. Think about that. They were after this guy, so instead they took two members of his family back to the police station, tortured them, clearly to say, where is he? And they died in custody. I mean, again, this is a supposedly democratic country. And this is only in the 1990s. This isn't that long ago, for those of us of a certain age. So in 1993, when the police were trying to track down Professor Buller with that bombing, he sought political asylum in Canada. Now, on his way, he was detained in Germany, where the German government rejected his asylum application and instead imprisoned him before then deporting him back to Delhi in 1995. I mean, horrific. Shame on Germany for that. Human rights groups cited that the deportation at the time was a violation of Article 3 of the European Convention on Human Rights to appeal the deportation. But shortly after Professor Buller was deported, the High German court overruled his asylum application rejection. Anyway, upon landing in Delhi in 1995, Buller was then detained without access to a lawyer and, unsurprisingly, he was tortured. Both violations of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Surprise, surprise, India ignoring international law. He was then imprisoned without trial for 5 years. I'll just repeat that. He was imprisoned without trial for 5 years. There's a familiar story even today. Jagtar Singh Johal, Amritpal Singh, etc., etc. So it took 5 years until 2001 to actually even come to trial. He was then convicted and sentenced to death. But Sikh organisations all around the world highlighted several issues, basic fundamental issues, which rendered his trial and sentencing as completely unfair. In other words, the whole thing seemed to be a completely drummed up charge. He was detained and arrested under a dreadful piece of legislation called the TADA. This piece of legislation, the TADA, the Terrorist and Disruptive Activities Prevention Act, brought in 1987. It was brought in, obviously, with the uprising of the Sikh community in self-defence against the genocide. So the TADA allowed Indian authorities to detain individuals based on vague allegations without trial. In other words, it was a piece of legislation that was entirely designed to give the Indian state complete carte blanche to detain anybody for basically any opinion. Even if they had a vague suspicion that somebody was guilty, that was it. The whole premise of the TADA was basically you're guilty until proven innocent, which is the reverse of the normal rule of law in any democratic nation, which is where you are presumed innocent until you're proven guilty. The TADA was actually eventually withdrawn because it was such a dreadful piece of legislation, a dangerous, undemocratic piece of legislation. However, he was actually originally arrested under the TADA. And these detainments under the TADA would obviously normally target minority groups and as a result resulted in huge human rights violations and, of course, the subsequent torture of those individuals. And it was actually the collective effort of human rights organisations and political parties around the world actually that eventually led to its review and its repeal in 1995, only 8 years later. And despite this piece of legislation lapsing and actually deemed unconstitutional, cases that resulted in convictions whilst it was enforced remained valid. And again, that is absolutely flying in the face of normal democratic rule of law. This piece of legislation, which was enacted and then rejected because it was unconstitutional, because it was deemed as a dreadful piece of legislation, even those people who were arrested and detained and sentenced under that legislation still remain in prison, where in fact by any rule of law they should immediately be released, because that law itself which they were sentenced under has been rejected as a valid piece of law. And yet people like Professor Buller remain in prison, who were imprisoned based on that law, still remains in prison. Anyway, so he endured a 6-year trial. He was then sentenced to death under this legislation. His conviction was based solely on a confession, which was later recanted, withdrawn, due to it being obtained under torture and coercion. Go figure. There was no other evidence against Professor Buller other than a confession, which was later withdrawn because it was known to have been signed under torture. In 2014, the Indian Supreme Court commuted his sentence, his death sentence. In other words, commuted it to essentially a prison sentence, at least saving his life, citing his declining mental health and, of course, the delay in the submission of his mercy petition. Professor Buller has now spent more than 31 years in jail and still remains in prison. So this injustice is actually further exemplified. For example, when comparing the case of, let's take another case, Bollywood actor Sanjay Dutt. Dutt was convicted under that same legislation, the TADA, in 1993, so around about the same time, for his involvement in buying weapons from those responsible for the Mumbai serial blast, for those who remember that. So this is another guy, a guy called Sanjay Dutt, arrested under the TADA at the same time. He served 18 months. 18 months. He was then allowed to leave prison. And in November 2006, he was then acquitted under the TADA and charged with a lesser conviction under the Arms Act, under which he was given a 6-year sentence, and he only served about 3.5 years. And in 2016, he was granted early release from prison based on good behaviour. So somebody else, who happened not to be a Sikh, there's a clue there, who was originally sentenced under the same piece of legislation, was released just a few years shortly after going to prison. So Professor Buller's arrest and his conviction are all part of this TADA. And this TADA gave police extraordinary powers for arrest and detention. The United Nations itself has condemned this act as disturbing and completely unacceptable, as it assumed a person was guilty until proven innocent. It allowed wide powers of arrest and detainment without trial and having no or minimum legal safeguards for a fair trial, which obviously is what's happened with Professor Buller. Now, it was succeeded by the UAPA, the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act, which is still very much there, which is still used today by the Indian state to imprison political dissenters. Amritpal Singh actually was detained under another piece of legislation, the NSA, the National Security Act, which is very similar to the UAPA. Another piece of legislation designed to weaponise the law against political opponents. The prosecution of Professor Buller basically was a result of an unfair trial. His conviction was based solely on a forced confession. He was tortured. He was actually forced, and the confession that was shown in court was actually his signature. He actually signed a blank piece of paper upon which a typed confession was later added. So he actually even didn't sign a confession under torture. He signed a blank piece of paper under torture, upon which then a confession was added afterwards. Now, normally in court, confessions are only accepted if they are either handwritten or in an audio-visual form. But in this case, an exception was made. Illegally, in the case of Professor Buller. So despite having 5 years of Professor Buller's illegal imprisonment to investigate the case, the prosecution was unable to produce any other corroborative evidence that implicated him. They produced 133 eyewitnesses, none of which were able to identify Professor Buller as guilty of any offence. There were 3 judges on the panel. One of the presiding judge, Justice Shah, found Buller not guilty. And he said, without there being corroborative evidence, this would not be a fit case for convicting the appellant solely on the basis of a so-called confessional statement. So one judge, the presiding judge, Justice Shah, bless him, said, no, this is nonsense. You can't condemn this man. We cannot sentence this man to guilty based on the so-called evidence. This is basically a fake confession. However, the other 2 judges, shame on them, voted for the death sentence, making it the first time in Indian history the death sentence was given on a split decision. Now, the Sikh community, whether across the diaspora or in Punjab, of course have been fighting against this imprisonment for decades. But of course, he's not just an ordinary prisoner, he is a political prisoner. And the grassroots consensus right across the community about his innocence, they are saying it's basic abuse of human rights. The President of India rejected a clemency petition in May 2011, 8 years after the request was filed, 8 years after. And during that time, while his mercy plea was being delayed for political reasons, there were worldwide candlelit vigils to raise attention to his plight. So the whole world are aware of his existence. In 2013, there was international backlash after a court review upheld the death sentence, as before it was commuted, and his execution seemed imminent. This is back in 2013. And at the time, Sikhs across the world called for the Indian government to remove him from death row immediately and retry the case based on the truth that we know has obviously since come out. A petition in the UK, here in the UK, was signed by 118,000 in his case, as well as India's, in the case of Professor Buller, as well as India's use of the death penalty. And it was also even discussed in Parliament here in the UK. And that, as a result of that pressure at that time, that's when the Supreme Court of India commuted his death sentence to life imprisonment. But unfortunately, 31 years later, he still remains in jail. He's apparently been receiving treatment for mental health in recent years. And this treatment hasn't been very effective. In 2015, he was transferred from Tihar jail to Amritsar jail and was last noted as undergoing treatment at the Government Medical College in Amritsar. And unfortunately, in 2016, he was released on parole for 21 days. He was able to spend at least some time with his family. And some viewed that as progress. But unfortunately, it coincided with elections. Go figure. He managed 21 days to spend with his family, but that, again, was a political move because it was election time, and they were, of course, sent back to prison. In 2021, a human rights Punjab-based lawyer, a guy called Jagtar Singh Johal, revealed all legal barriers for Professor Buller's release were now removed. He could be freed upon the say-so of Delhi. And Chief Minister Arvind Kejriwal at the time of the Aam Admi Party would have to say that. Unfortunately, it didn't happen. And it's happened again in 2022, 2023. There were situations where it was hoped he was going to be released imminently. It still hasn't happened. In other words, the BJP government, Narendra Modi's shameful government, still have this guy behind bars 31 years later. His sentence was actually 20 years. 31 years later, he still remains in prison. In prison, sentenced on the basis of a false confession, a faked confession, with no other corroborative evidence. It is an absolute outrageous affront to the rule of law. It is an absolute affront to a so-called democratic nation. India should be ashamed of itself that an educated, intelligent gentleman like this remains behind bars. Even if he was guilty of the original crime, which it clearly is the case that he wasn't, because there is no evidence to support that. Even if he was, he would have been released by now. His death sentence in the first place was clearly politically motivated, where even one of the judges said there's absolutely no reason to find this gentleman guilty. And yet, clearly, the other two judges felt otherwise, clearly under pressure from the Indian state to find him guilty. This is, the politicisation of the Indian judicial system. A system that operated well when the British handed it over to the Indian Brahmins in 1947, and the Brahmins have then, since 1947, weaponised it to target political prisoners like this. As I say, it is an absolute outrage that a gentleman like this, who clearly has committed no crime, has spent the large majority of his life behind bars with no prospect of being released. How many people have we had, sadly, to mention like this who remain political prisoners in India? The Bandi Singhs, who I refer to on a regular basis. Again, gentlemen who have served their sentences and yet still remain behind bars. India cannot claim itself to be a democracy. It cannot claim itself to be a country that follows the rule of law as long as people like this remain in prison, unjustifiably so. It's not just a legal outrage. It's an outrage against just basic human rights. The fact that many of these, if not all of these, have been tortured. Torture features hugely in all these gentlemen's stories. In virtually everybody, it seems, who's detained, particularly if you're a Sikh, God help you, you will be tortured by the police. Again, it's just, I shake my head in absolute horror and disgust for a nation that I used to hold in such high regard. As I've always said, I'm not anti-India, I'm very pro-India. I love India, I love its culture, I love its people. But what I absolutely despise is the Brahmanical elite of India who preside over dreadful acts of undemocratic, illegal, so-called justice against political dissenters. They are nothing more than political prisoners. A nation that has even one political prisoner cannot call itself a democracy. And yet our nation's leaders, whether it's Trump, Starmer, Carney, Albanese, whoever it happens to be, your own leaders have all pretty much shaken hands with a man who is responsible for a lot of this. It's absolutely appalling. We should all be pressurising and getting out and taking, frankly, to the streets to protest against this and to protest our own nations shaking hands and signing trade deals with nations, with a nation that can do something like this. And Professor Bullah is so symbolic, as is Amritpal Singh, as is Jagtar Singh Johal, as is all these Bhai Singhs here, the Bandi Singhs. It's just, it's absolutely appalling and shocking and shameful. Anyway, let's move on. And I want to talk about the RSS and the evils of the RSS in the United States. Interestingly, for those regular watchers of the show, know that a couple of weeks ago, I think it was, I did a very interesting article on a huge amount of research that's been done by Sciences Po, which is a French political university, or a series of political universities in France, who worked with the Caravan magazine, did incredible work to draw a global map of RSS organisations or RSS affiliated organisations. It is this web, this network of organisations, bodies, political bodies, charities, even low-level local charities or whatever, who are all affiliated to the RSS. In other words, pushing the Hindutva agenda around the world. Unsurprisingly, of course, one of these happened to be in the United States, in the heart of the US administration. Another organisation called PRISM, which is an organisation that undertakes excellent investigative journalist work, uncovered a bit of RSS mischief going on. And it all centred around a company called Squire Patton Boggs. This is a company that lobbied on behalf of the RSS last year and up until last year. But Squire Patton Boggs terminated the campaign weeks after this particular investigation that detailed the RSS's lobbying activities. Now, this is important because the lobbying industry is a huge industry around certainly Western democracies, where our governments are lobbied. That means they are pressured by groups who are pushing their own agenda. They are trying to act as effectively as they can. These lobby groups are organisations that meet up with politicians, that knock on the doors of our leaders, our political leaders, to say, look, please, you need to listen to us. Here is all the evidence that we will set out in front of you to influence your decision making so that you enact policies that act in our interest. That is basically what a lobby group exists for. Big Pharma is a prime example of this. The telecommunications industry, they literally have billions of dollars of resources. Literally, they spend billions of dollars every year to fund lobbying organisations that then knock on the doors of our politicians, MPs, members of legislative assemblies, whatever it is, and say, look, here's lots of evidence. Please, you must enact policies that are in our interests. That's what a lobbying organisation is for. It's basically evil, because it means the more money that you have, the more powerful your political lobbying can be. And therefore, this is why the rich and the powerful and the wealthy can influence politics. Sadly, our own system, democratic system, is not perfect. It is sadly influenceable and manipulatable by people with wealth. The RSS is a very, very wealthy organisation. It is capable of manipulating our politics. It is capable of influencing our legislation, our laws, to obviously act in the interests of the RSS, the Hindu state. PRISM uncovered some lobbying that was going on. So the RSS, as it turned out, after this investigation, well done the PRISM, is no longer working with lobbyists in the US after launching its first known lobbying campaign targeting members of Congress last January. So last January, the RSS did launch what it thought was a stealth campaign to lobby members of Congress in the United States. And what it did, it employed this company, Squire Patton Boggs. There are these companies that exist that you can pay to lobby on your behalf. So I can go to Squire Patton Boggs. Here's $1 million. Please go lobby the US government, and I want you to lobby for these interests. In other words, get the US government to change its policies so that it benefits me. And here's $1 million for that benefit. So that's how it works. So Squire Patton Boggs, that was basically paid by the RSS, terminated the campaign weeks after this investigation that uncovered the RSS's lobbying activities. Now, on November the 12th last year, the report came out in PRISM. It reported that Squire Patton Boggs received $330,000 in the first 3 quarters of 2025 to lobby officials in the US Senate and House of Representatives on behalf of the RSS. So if that had continued, we're looking at potentially millions of dollars over the coming years poured into this one organisation by the RSS to lobby the US Senate and the House of Representatives on behalf of the RSS. It's shocking, isn't it? Now, a review of congressional disclosure documents by PRISM found that the RSS had not been identified as a foreign entity. And this is where it gets a little bit legal, so stay with me on this. It hadn't been. The RSS was not identified as a foreign entity, despite the organisation being based in India. Multiple experts interviewed by PRISM also raised concerns that Squire Patton Boggs did not register its RSS lobbying under the Foreign Agents Registration Act, FARA, F-A-R-A. This is a 1938 law that requires transparency from representatives of foreign interests. This is really important because there have been lots of cases now, and in California, another case actually being pushed by one of the Gurdwaras in California, a legal case. They are forcing organizations, including, I think it's the Hindu Foundation of America, they are being forced now to register as foreign agents. In other words, legally, if they are acting on behalf of a foreign government, they must register the fact. They can't hide it. They must register it. Otherwise, it is illegal. And this is basically what PRISM uncovered, that the RSS, by using Squire Patton Boggs, should have been registered as a foreign agent. But it wasn't. And this is what's happening all over America. The RSS is employing all these local organisations to push the Hindu agenda, particularly politically speaking. Legally, they are required to register the fact that they are acting on behalf of a foreign agent, these organisations, but they don't in many cases. They're trying to hide it. One wonders how many still haven't been uncovered. So this is what's going on, and well done to the PRISM, they uncovered this. And the day after that PRISM actually uncovered their investigation, an RSS spokesperson denied that the RSS was working with lobbyists in the US, but a week later, an RSS publication appeared to contradict the spokesperson, claiming that the RSS's activities were actually fully disclosed under the Lobbying Disclosure Act of 1995, the LDA. That's another piece of law. This is another piece of transparency law for activities designed to obviously influence the federal government. Now, the PRISM reported, its report prompted a huge backlash, unsurprisingly, in India from the Godi media, including leaders of the country's largest opposition party. So, of course, the Godi media said, this is outrageous, you can't accuse us of this, unsurprisingly. But the political opposition, obviously the Congress party, jumped on this. And, of course, they said, look, you can't do this. And they did criticise the Indian government. But the Indian news outlets published editorials, actually even them questioned the RSS's campaign and described it as, in their words, alarming and potentially harmful to Indian interests, democracy and credibility. So even some of the media in India actually said, look, this is not just embarrassing, it's actually damaging our reputation on the global stage. Now, the RSS is not registered as a legal entity in India. And critics say this enables a lack of financial transparency and accountability. Oh, what a surprise! So the RSS deliberately isn't registered as a legal entity, because if it was, it would be required legally to be transparent, to open up its financial books and be held accountable. But because it isn't registered, it can hide in the background. And in November last year, just 3 months ago, in response to these sorts of criticisms, the RSS chief, Mohan Bhagwat, said, we are categorised as a body of individuals. We are a recognised organisation. The RSS is used to operate in opaque and non-transparent ways in India and appears to have assumed it could do the same. Oh, sorry, I beg your pardon. This is another quote from somebody else. It appears to have assumed it could do the same in the US by lobbying quietly and flying under the radar. This is a guy called Rakib Hamid Naik. He's the founder and exec director of the Centre for the Study of Organised Hate in Washington, D.C. It's a think tank that researches political extremism. So this guy actually said that the RSS are used to getting away with it in India, being opaque, as he called it. In other words, it's not transparent. And they thought they could do the same in the United States, but unfortunately got a bit of a rude shock as it discovered they would. So sadly, that is the case. This sort of article goes on in great detail about what it did. But basically, to summarise this article, the RSS are being caught out. They've been caught out trying to get away with lobbying the US government by using a third party, this US-based lobbying organisation, paying it a lot of money, a huge amount of money, and potentially millions of dollars over the next coming years, until it was caught by this investigation. But one wonders what else is going on beneath the hood, beneath the surface, It does really raise questions. And SB 509 in California is another prime example of this. Governor Newsom rejected a bill designed to assist the fight against transnational oppression, particularly the Sikh community, but not just the Sikh community, but all minority communities in California. That bill was supported by minority organisations right across California. It was assumed it would be rubber stamped by the governor. Why wouldn't it be? It was a great piece of legislation. Instead, it was rejected out of hand under really spurious grounds. And all the organisations in California said, what? And it's very clear he was pressured under the same sort of lobbying activities. Again, opaque, non-transparent activities. In other words, unaccountable activities by these organisations, ultimately acting on behalf of the RSS, lobbying American politicians to change American law. SB 509, an absolute prime example of that. That sadly continues. Right, let's move across, and I'm going to continue with the theme of Indian injustice. Yes, here we go again. Jagtar Singh Johal has just spent yesterday his 9th birthday behind bars in India. Again, it's an absolute affront to justice, to democracy. 3,021 days, 22 today now, 3,022 days Jagtar Singh Johal has spent behind bars, still awaiting any sentencing. Today sees the NIA, the National Investigation Agency, presenting him at Patiala House Court in Delhi once again for what will be his 57th trial hearing. It's just disgusting. Fortunately, his MP, his Member of Parliament here in the UK, continues to lobby. I'm going to play you a video now. This is yesterday in the British Parliament. This is Jaggy's MP speaking. Let me, sorry, wrong one. There we go. Let me play this.
This deal is a clear statement of intent that the UK is open to trade, serious about growth, and prepared to engage constructively with the world. However, these deeper relationships bring deeper responsibilities. I am encouraged by growth in relations between India and Britain, which is why I hope it can open up meaningful dialogue about diplomatic issues. As most of the House will be aware, my Western Bartonshire constituent Jagtar Singh Johal has been arbitrarily detained in India since 2017. It's been over 8 years now, 3,020 days. In 2022, the United Nations Working Group on Arbitrary Detention concluded that his imprisonment was arbitrary and called for his immediate release. Last year, he was acquitted of all charges with respect to the only case against which has proceeded to trial. Despite this, he continues to be detained on 8 other cases, all similar charges with the same witnesses and the same discredited evidence. We must do more as a government than simply raise his case with Indian counterparts. It's often remarked that we must respect the Indian judicial system. However, any legal system which remands an individual, a UK citizen, for over 8 years is not worth our respect. Worryingly, he's recently been transferred to Tahir Jail in New Delhi, which is infamous for its overcrowding and its violence. I hope his case can be resolved following this closer and friendlier relationship with India, and therefore his release can be advanced. I can advise the House that today is Jagtar's birthday. He will be 39 today. This will be his 9th birthday detained in an Indian prison. His family in Western Bartonshire are deeply concerned about his well-being. They have shown extraordinary resilience and dignity over many years, and they continue to hope for progress. This agreement marks a new phase in our UK-India relationship. It establishes regular channels of engagement and strengthens trust between our two governments, and I truly hope that this renewed partnership can support continued constructive discussions about Jagtar's case with the aim of securing his release and return to his family in Dumbarton. I urge the Government to continue raising this matter consistently and carefully with the Indian authorities, and to ensure that Jagtar and his family know that he remains a priority to us. On behalf of Western Bartonshire, I warmly welcome this comprehensive economic and trade agreement. It is a deal that will deliver real economic benefit by supporting jobs, driving investment and strengthening our whisky industry. It means opportunity for workers, for business, for tourism and for future generations. It marks a major milestone in our relationship with India, one that is future-focused and built on renewed trust. It is testament to this government's promise to deliver, and it positions our United Kingdom to grow and compete in a rapidly changing world. This deal invests in our future and will have a real meaningful impact in my constituency, and I fully support it, and I look forward to seeing it deliver for Western Bartonshire and for the United Kingdom as a whole. But I also hope that this closer relationship can help bring resolution to the deeply troubling case of my constituent Jagtar Singh Johal and deliver the outcome that he and his family deserve. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Now, interestingly, a lot of his speech was dedicated to the trade deal that's been signed by India and the United Kingdom. And it stands in contrast to many of his previous times that he stood up in Parliament and been quite fiery against the Starmer government. He actually is part of the Starmer government. He is a Labour MP, so he is part of the government, the governing party. But all his previous speeches in Parliament have been quite direct. What are you doing about Jagtar Singh Johal? He's saying it's all. He's said in the past it's all very well signing trade deals, but what are you doing about Jagtar Singh Johal? Now look at his stance. He's had to try and change his stance. Now this could be one of two reasons. One is either being told stop being so irritating, basically, to the Starmer government and be a bit more positive, or secondly, he's thought, okay, all my direct demands are just being ignored. I'll try and be a little bit more diplomatic in my language. I'll say what a great trade deal it is, but at the same time, what are you doing about Jagtar Singh Johal? Ultimately, it almost doesn't matter. Our useless government, the Starmer government, which is literally about to fall, or at least Starmer himself is about to fall, our useless Prime Minister is shortly about to lose his job or quit or whatever, one of the two. But ultimately, like the previous useless Conservative government, have done absolutely nothing other than talk about Jagtar Singh Johal. We're doing everything we can. We're raising at every opportunity. And yet, Douglas McAllister, who succeeded his predecessor, who used to do the same with the Conservative government, he has to stand up on a regular basis in the British Parliament saying, what are you doing about bringing Jagtar Singh Johal home? Why are we still signing trade deals with India, a nation that imprisons people like Jagtar Singh Johal, Professor Buller, amongst many others? Why are we signing trade deals with this nation? Now, he's had to, unfortunately, toe the political diplomatic line here and say, yes, it's a great trade deal. It's great for us. It's great for Scotland, obviously where Jaggy's from and where he represents. It's great for our nation, but we still must try and release Jagtar. It's sad in many ways he's had to sort of bring down his language to a more diplomatic level, because somebody needs to hold the feet to the fire of the British government. It needs to hold the British government's feet, not just to the fire, this is an English idiom, but actually put the British government's feet in the fire until it bloody burns to get them to do something about Jagtar Singh Johal. It's outrageous. And it's also interesting, just as a side note, there was a British citizen, a guy called Lai, I think his name is, who the Chinese have imprisoned. He's been campaigning for human rights in Hong Kong. He's just been imprisoned and remains in prison. Actually, he's been in prison for a few years now. The British government and the media have been very vocal, saying, why isn't the British government doing more about this guy Lai in Hong Kong? And the British government say, yeah, we're doing everything we can to release him. We will release him. But silence about Jagtar Singh Johal. Why? It's absolute, again, it's a shame and it's a stain on the British government. You know, it's just appalling. Anyway, let's move on. The clock's counting down. Let's move on to the comments column. Thank you to each and every one of you who have commented. Very much appreciated. As I say, I do read every single comment, and I love every single comment, even the rude ones. They always raise a smile and a chuckle. Joe Bunsing, thank you. This was I did a podcast last week with Dr. Grail. It was a fascinating one, I have to say. It was a podcast that talked about the mistakes made by the United States in the Vietnam War, why they lost the war. The war was essentially, one of the architects of the war, the methodology of the war, was a guy called Robert S. McNamara. And he acknowledged after the war, my design was deeply wrong. The way we tackled the Vietnam War was completely wrong. We got it wrong. We thought they were just acting as agents they were a communist proxy for China, for Russia, etc. Basically, we were up against communists. That's what the war was all about. It wasn't. They misunderstood what the Vietnam War was all about. The North Vietnamese were fighting with the communists, but they were using the communists as a platform, because what they were really fighting about was their homeland. It was a war of nationalism. They were fighting for an independent homeland. They wanted to shake off the Western influence and Western power in Vietnam. It was a war against an ideology. And that was the lesson that came from the Vietnam War, which by extension, when you talk about the war against the Sikhs in the Punjab, India is losing that war because what they don't understand, they are making exactly the same mistakes that the United States did in the 1960s and 70s in Vietnam. India is making exactly the same mistakes, how they are tackling this war against the Punjabi khalistan movement. And that's why inevitably they're going to lose, because they're making exactly the same mistakes. Watch that podcast. It was fascinating, actually. It's a very interesting parallel between the two. Jayban Singh, thank you, Jayban. Yes, use a teleprompter. Yeah, because Gurinder, Dr. Grail, when I was talking to him, he had to read from a script sometimes for some of the key details, and he did actually tend to look down. Don't worry, we have addressed that. I've just recorded tomorrow's podcast, actually, which is, again, another fascinating one. In fact, there are 2 podcasts, tomorrow and Friday, on different subjects, so do watch those. Again, interesting ones. But we've hopefully addressed this issue where he's actually is able to look more at the camera. Thank you, Jayban. Comment noted. Bobby Singh, time is of the essence. Indeed it is. The sooner that Khalistan's created, the better for everybody. Absolutely. Not just Sikhs, but of course, people from all backgrounds. Stay Safe says Human Rights Watch reports stacked to the roof. Yeah. In other words, the abuses of human rights against all minorities, not just Sikhs actually, but against Christians, against Muslims, Jains, or you name it, in India. Those reports from human rights organisations, including Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, etc., they're this high. Samsung says, freedom leads to innovation. It does. Freedom leads to prosperity. This is what Khalistan is about. Once the people of Punjab are free of the yoke of Indian control, that is going to generate so much industry, so much commerce, so much innovation. Because when you're free, of course you think there is an incentive for me to innovate, to grow. And we do know that Sikhs as a community are deeply, genetically entrepreneurial. They just can't help it. Wherever Sikhs go, they build, they create. And that is, of course, why Khalistan will be an enormous success. Verdi, 1984, when the Indian government attacked the Akhal Takat and 40 or more Gurdwaras around Punjab, they thought that this would defeat the Sikh community. They thought this would defeat Sikhi. And what that Robert McNamara podcast actually proved, you cannot defeat an ideology. This is why the US lost in Vietnam. They thought they were just fighting against a communist army. They weren't. They were fighting against an ideology, a nationalist movement. That is what India does not get. India is fighting what it sees a war of numbers. The more Sikhs it can kill means that we're going to win. As long as we keep killing Sikhs, we'll win this war. That's what the US thought in Vietnam. It didn't matter how many Vietnamese they killed, they still lost the war because they're fighting an ideology. An ideology, as I used in the podcast, the metaphor, it's like trying to squeeze a balloon in your hand. It doesn't matter how hard you squeeze, the balloon is always going to find ways of sneaking out little bubbles of freedom. And that is how you end up losing fighting against an ideology. It doesn't matter how hard you squeeze, how violent or hard you hit it, it will always find a way out. It will always find a way to express itself. You cannot kill an ideology. That is why Khalistan is inevitable. B.K. Harold, Bikara. The fact remains, now this is a little bit of cynicism, and I think this is justified. When Bhagwant Mann, the Chief Minister of Punjab, prostrated himself in front of the Akhal Takat a few days ago, as you say, the Jatadars of the Akhal Takat since 1986 have sprouted from Badal's pocket. Indeed, we often talk about how the Badals have controlled the SGPC, the organisation that elects the Jatadars of the Akhal Tax, of the 5 tax rather. And of course, they're in the Badal family's pocket. The current one's no different. This drama of the Chief Minister is purely a political stunt. It's to remove the current Aam Admi Party and to reinstate the Badal Dal, and thus, or the Shiromani Akali Dal, controlled by the Badal family, and thus the RSS once again gets direct control of the state. They are, of course, RSS core members. Indeed they are. Yeah, you're absolutely right, actually. I think this is a great perspective. Thank you, B. Kara, for this one. This, of course, does, when we see Bhagwant Mann prostrating himself in front of the Jatadar of the Akhal Taxt, you think, great, this is nice. I even said at the time, this is the exertion of Sikh power, which it is in many ways. But ultimately, as you said, it was a political stunt. Yeah, one has to question, why did Bhagwant Mann do this? Of course, it was a political stunt, ultimately. Go figure. Hardal Singh, justice denied is justice delayed. We Sikhs are yes sir attitude. It's hard to change. Yeah, this is almost how, sadly, many Sikhs have just basically been forced into submission. This is what happened to the militant movement in the 80s and 90s. It was basically forced into submission by this battering of the Indian state, this almost limitlessly resourced Indian state that gets its way just through sheer brute force and its limitless resources. And unfortunately, many Sikhs, as you say, Hardal Singh, says, too many Sikhs are just, yes sir, whatever you say, sir. They've given in. Actually, I find that hard to believe because most Sikhs and certainly Sikhs in our audience, do have a hard core of resistance. They do have an iron backbone. They have a backbone that's so strong and resilient that they certainly, I cannot accuse any of our audience of being yes sirs at all. Maybe back in the Punjab, some. But I would say is that once the Khalistan movement does become more public, particularly in the Punjab, I think you'll find that many of the yes sir Sikhs in Punjab will actually start to shake off that indoctrination, shake off that submission. And once they're given hope, an inkling of hope, and that's why people in the Punjab, more people in the Punjab need to watch this show, that there is more than an inkling of hope. Because once they're shown that glimmer, that shaft of sunlight of hope, that Khalistan is coming, they will start to wake up and be reinvigorated and get their self-pride back and start having a bit more confidence in themselves, knowing that the future is bright, the future is yellow, the future is Khalistan. Jagtar Singh, yes, by Surinder Singh, he was off air for about a week. He's back. Happy to say he is back. Panic not. And I assume, of course, that's in Punjabi, and I can only assume that your question was about Surinder, because Stay Safe kindly responded to that. Yes, I think he's back. I think there was a show yesterday. I assume there'll be a show today. So hopefully that puts your fears at rest. Mita, the SGPC Act, I think it was in 1925, 1928. Anyway, it said that only baptised Amritdhari Sikhs who have become members of the Khalsa are considered Sikhs. All others with their hair and beards cut and who are non-baptised are classified as Hindus. That's interesting. I didn't actually know that under the Act. I'll have to check that Act out in detail, because, of course, this then immediately creates a division, which is obviously what these pieces of legislation, like the Constitution, are designed to do. It's designed to suppress the Sikh community into submission and divide it, claiming they're all Hindus. Interesting. Gurinder, this actually I think is Gurinder, Dr. Grewal, who I interviewed in the podcast, who had that discussion about Robert McNamara in the previous slide. And indeed, I've got a couple of podcasts coming out Thursday, Friday this week with Dr. Grewal. And he did actually, in tomorrow's uploaded podcast, when it's uploaded, we did discuss the Anand Karaj. He was very complimentary about my coverage of the Anand Karaj. I do hope all of you appreciated that rundown of the wedding ceremony. He certainly felt it was a good explanation. So, as I say, it was very much a learning journey for myself on that one. Pam Singh. Hi, Pam. We always watch, trust, share and believe in your perceptive programme. Thank you. You are a Khalsa warrior. Gosh, I'd see that as a huge compliment, as is James. And it was a deep dive with a lot of knowledge and understanding that I bring to the show is second to none. Brilliant work. Amazing show with humour. Thank you, Pam. That's a really lovely comment. I would deem it an absolute honour to be a Khalsa warrior. I'm a little bit long in the tooth and a little bit creaky in the joints, but I will certainly don my if I could ever don the uniform of a Nihang warrior. I think a bit too old for that. But certainly I'd see it as a complete honour to stand, I don't know about the front row, a bit old to be on the front row of the Khalsa army, but certainly I will be there in spirit and in body to fight the good fight. And I like this comment. My Palwa Singh says, thanks, brother. That term brother, I see that again as a huge compliment. It's sort of, I feel very welcomed, and I've always felt very welcomed into the Sikh family, the Sikh global family. I've always had this hugely I often refer to this warm, fuzzy feeling, even through the comments. I just get this warm, fuzzy feeling of being welcomed, of being embraced by the Sikh family. And again, for me, it's a complete honour to do it. And so I love what I do, and I'm deeply passionate about what I do because I totally, utterly align with the values of Sikhi and the whole concept of Khalistan. And Sach says, just saying, which you already knew, thanks for standing with us. As I say, it is more than my pleasure. It is my duty to do so. Much respect, etc. I'm just imagining how you will be welcomed every time you enter Khalistan. I'm damn sure you'll be highly respected with highest badges. Well, I do look forward, as indeed James. James and I will consider it an absolute honour and a pleasure on the day that Khalistan is founded, God willing that we are still here in body, that we will definitely be in Khalistan on the day of independence. We will sit there and we will do our first broadcast on behalf of the Khalistan Broadcasting Corporation. We will do the first perspective shows to inaugurate the first day of Khalistan. And you are all very welcome to join me and James on that day, and very much look forward to that day. Be there. please do, because I certainly, God willing, will be there in person as well. And Baz Singh Kala can join that final comment with Satch. Khalistan Zindabad. It is coming. The Khalistan train is not just thundering down the tracks. It is heading square on for the Indian subcontinent. We look forward to the day that Google Maps recognises that geographical boundary of Khalistan, because it is indeed coming. We look forward to that day. Thanks so much, as always, for everyone. I must wrap things up now. Don't forget, please do message me at message@satlugetv.com. I do read every email. You can reach me directly through that email address. Let me know what you'd like me to talk about. Let me know your thoughts. Whatever. Send me an email. Otherwise, please do leave a comment below. Much appreciated. So I do read every comment. Let me know what you think. Let me know stories that you think I should be covering or I might have missed that you think definitely need to be covered. But that is it for another day. As I say, tomorrow and Friday there'll be 2 podcasts being uploaded. So this is the final Perspectives of this week. I'll be back, God willing, on Monday with the next Perspectives show. But do watch out for the 2 podcasts being uploaded tomorrow and Friday. But that's it for another week from Perspectives. Have a great rest of the week, the rest of you. And we'll see you next week, God willing.